They catalogued her between the parlor drapes and the butter moulds. Not with a name anyone had ever called her by, not with an age or a face or a single line acknowledging that she was a person who had opinions about the cold, and preferred her tea without sugar, and had once in another life been taught to read Latin by a father who thought it was the least a daughter deserved. Just a single typed entry on the third page of the household inventory of Aldcroft Manor, positioned below a set of Irish linen curtains valued at 4 shillings and above a wooden press used for the kitchen dairy. Seamstress, bonded. Retained for domestic service against outstanding household accounts. To transfer with the property upon change of title. The solicitor from the county office had come with 2 clerks and a leather satchel, and he had walked through every room of the manor with Oswald pen at his elbow, naming prices, as if the whole place were a market stall. Esme Halwood had followed the way she always followed things she was not supposed to hear. With a mending basket over one arm and her eyes on the floor and her ears sharp as a cat's in a quiet house. She heard the long case clock in the entrance hall assessed at £9. She heard the Flemish tapestry in the dining room priced at 12, though she knew her father had paid twice that for it. She heard her own name, or rather the version of her name that Penn had given her 3 years ago when he brought her here and told her she was to be grateful. And she heard it spoken in exactly the same flat administrative tone as the butter moulds. The solicitor had not even looked up from his page. Penn had explained, smoothly, that the girl came with the house, that she had been bound into service against a domestic debt, that it was tidier to pass her along than to settle separate arrangements. The solicitor had written it down without comment, the way men write down things they do not intend to think about again. Esme set her mending basket on a side table and left the room, and the 2 clerks went on talking about the silver service, and not one of them marked that she had gone. She did not cry in the corridor. She had used up that habit some time in the first year. She went instead to the narrow window on the servants' stair and looked out over the east lawn. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had braced herself for many things in the 3 years she had lived under this roof. She had braced herself for cold and for hunger and for the slow, grinding weight of a debt that had been someone else's and had been placed on her like a yoke without her consent. She had not braced herself to be written into a property ledger between the linen drapes and the dairy equipment. She was not a seamstress. She had been very careful for 3 years to behave like one, to keep her eyes down and her tongue quiet and her hands occupied with whatever needle and thread Penn pointed her toward, because a girl who wanted to survive learned quickly what kind of girl she was permitted to be in a house like this one. But she was not a seamstress. Her father had been Lord Aldcroft. That was the fact that Penn had spent 3 years and whatever money it cost him burying. Lord Aldcroft had died when Esme was 21, in debt, in a cold October, with no sons and no husband yet found for his daughter, and a cousin standing at the edge of the family like a man who has been watching a door and knows eventually it will open. Penn was that cousin. Penn had been waiting at that door for a very long time. He had told the county that Lord Aldcroft had died without issue. He had produced documents. He had produced a witness Esme had never seen before and had not seen since. He had told Esme privately that if she made no noise, she would be housed and fed, and that if she made noise, there were other arrangements for difficult young women, and she would not enjoy them. She had been 21 and alone and without proof of anything, and so she had made no noise. She had taken the gray dress and the mending basket, and she had become what Penn wrote her down as, and she had waited for something that might change. The new Earl of Aldcroft was that something, or might be. She did not know yet. His name was Cormac Dunhill, and he had won the title through a lateral claim that Penn had not anticipated and had spent 6 months fighting in letters that grew increasingly intemperate. Esme had read 2 of them. She had a talent for reading things left on desks by men who believed that servants did not read. The Earl arrived on a Tuesday in a plain black traveling coach with no crest on the door. She noticed that first. A man who needed you to know his consequence painted it on the side of his conveyance. A man who did not need you to know anything rode in plain black. She watched from the staircase window the way she had watched the solicitor come, because watching was what she had instead of acting, and she had become very good at it. Penn met him at the steps with his best warmth and his best coat and his hand already extended. The Earl walked past the hand as though he had not seen it. He looked at the house. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that has been described to him many times, and he is checking the description against the fact, noting where the 2 disagree. Then he went inside, and Penn scrambled to follow, and the warmth in Penn's face had thinned by the width of one unreturned greeting. Esme went back to her mending room. They spread the inventory on the long table in the estate room for his review. That was the custom. She understood. When a man of consequence was to take possession of a property, the ledger of what he was receiving was laid before him for inspection and signature. Penn stood beside it explaining things. Esme heard his voice through the wall. And because the mending room adjoined the estate room through a shared chimney breast, and because she had spent 3 years learning which cracks in the plaster carried sound, she heard most of what was said on the other side. She heard Penn explain the clock. She heard him explain the tapestry. She heard him explain the horses, 3 of them, which was 2 more than the estate could properly afford to keep. She heard him explain, in the same tone, that the seamstress was bonded to the household and would transfer with the rest of the domestic staff. And then she heard something she had not heard before. Silence. Not the silence of a man considering, the silence of a man who has stopped. Penn filled it quickly with an explanation of the seamstress's household duties, the tasks she performed, the efficiency of retaining her rather than hiring replacements. The Earl of Aldcroft said nothing. And then, very quietly, he said, "Read me that entry again." A pause, then Penn read it. Seamstress, bonded, retained against domestic accounts, to transfer with the property. Another silence. "What is her name?" the Earl said. Penn said her name, the working name, the gray dress name, the one he had given her, and Esme, her ear pressed to the plaster, went very still. Because the Earl said it again. Not aloud. She did not hear words. She heard the particular silence of a man repeating something inward, checking it against something he carries in his own memory, finding the place where it fits or fails to fit. "How long has she been in this house?" the Earl said. 3 years, my lord. And before that. Penn made a sound that was almost a laugh, the particular sound of a man who has rehearsed his confidence. "She has no before that worth mentioning. She came to us without—" "How old is she?" The question was quiet and flat, and it cut Penn off the way a closed door cuts off a draft. Penn gave her age. Esme heard the Earl's chair push back. She heard his footsteps, slow and unhurried, cross the estate room floor. She heard him say, to someone she assumed was his solicitor, a man named Weathers, who had arrived in a second coach, that he would like a few moments. The room cleared. She heard Penn's voice moving down the corridor, bright with reassurance for the clerks, explaining that his lordship was very thorough. And then, from the other side of the plaster, nothing but the occasional sound of a page turning. He was reading the inventory, all of it, line by line. Esme sat very still in her mending room with a half-repaired pillow slip in her hands and listened to the silence of a man reading, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, something she did not entirely know how to name. Not hope. Hope was too large a word for what she felt. It was smaller than hope. It was the thing that comes before hope when hope is still too frightened to step into the light. The awareness that something had shifted, slightly, in the weight of things, and the shift might matter. Then the bell in the estate room rang. Penn came back. The Earl said, still in that same level voice, "I am not going to sign this inventory." Penn's voice went carefully, precisely pleasant. "My lord, if there is some difficulty with the terms." "The terms are not my concern. The terms are straightforward. It is this entry." The Earl's voice did not rise. A person cannot be itemized in a property ledger and transferred as goods in a bill of sale. I don't know what arrangement you have made regarding this woman, but it does not belong in this document, and I will not put my name to a document that lists a human being as a transferable asset of the estate. Penn said something careful about the legality of indentured arrangements, the precedent, the settled debt. The Earl said, "Bring me a pen." Penn said he didn't understand. "I will explain it with a pen in my hand," the Earl said. "Bring me one." Esme set down the pillow slip. She heard the solicitor Weathers produce a pen. She heard the scratch of it on paper. She heard the Earl speak to Weathers in a low voice, confirming something was witnessed and dated. She heard Weathers say yes and give the date and sign his own name beneath it. She did not know what had been written. She would not know for some time. But in the cold mending room, with its permanent smell of old wool, she felt the weight shift again, more definitively, and she sat with it and tried to breathe. Penn came to find her that evening. He stood in the doorway with the face she knew, the one that showed nothing on the surface and moved very quickly underneath, and he told her that the Earl wished to speak with her in the morning. Alone. She asked why. Penn said he didn't know. His jaw was set in a way she recognized as controlled alarm. She sat with that alarm long after he had gone, in the cold and the quiet, and she thought of everything she knew and everything she did not. She thought of the thing she had kept for 3 years, in the locked corner of her traveling trunk, which Penn had not been able to take from her because he did not know it existed. A brooch, small, oval, shell cameo set in gold, worn smooth at the edges from handling. A woman's profile very fine. On the back in lettering too small to read without good light. E.H. from her mother with all love, Aldcroft, 1848. She had held it so many times that the gold was worn to silk under her thumb. She thought, "In the morning I will go into that room with my head level and my eyes open. I will not perform ignorance. I will not perform fear. I will see what happens." He was already in the estate room when she arrived. He had come early, alone. No solicitor, no clerks, no pen at the door. He stood beside the long table with his hands at his sides, and he looked at her when she came in with the particular attention of a man checking a memory. She looked back at him. She had been trained out of that. 3 years in this house had worked hard to teach her to look at the floor. She looked at him anyway. He was perhaps 35, plainly dressed. The face gave away very little, but it was not the face of a man who had come to do something unkind. She had learned in 3 years to know that face, and this was not it. There was a tiredness in him that she recognized because she saw it every morning in her own mirror. The tiredness of someone who has been carrying something alone for longer than it should take. "Miss Halwood," he said. She had not been called that in 3 years. She felt the name land somewhere in her chest like a hand pressing against a bruise she had learned to ignore. "My lord," she said. He did not sit, and so she did not sit, and they stood in the cold morning light with the inventory on the table between them. "I want to ask you something," he said. "I would like you to think before you answer. Not because I disbelieve you, but because the answer matters more than you may know." She said nothing, because that seemed right. "Your father," he said, "do you remember him?" She had expected many things. Not that. She felt her stillness waver and recovered it. "Yes," she said, "I remember him clearly." "What was his name?" She held the Earl's gaze. "Lord Aldcroft," she said. "Edwin Halwood, the fourth Lord Aldcroft. He died 3 years ago in October. Oswald Penn told the county he died without issue." She paused. "He did not." The Earl said nothing for a moment. Something shifted in his face, just barely, just enough to let through a fraction of what lay behind it. "I was at school with your father," he said. "He was 2 years my senior. He was a generous man. I owed him more than I ever repaid, and he died before I had the chance." He held her gaze steadily. "He wrote to me 6 months before he died. He said he was ill, that he had a daughter, and that he was afraid for her. He asked me to look in on her when I was able, to see that she was well placed." His jaw tightened slightly. "I was in the north. The letter came late. By the time I answered it, he was dead, and the county record said no daughter had survived him." Esme's hands were very still. She had learned stillness too well for this moment to show in her hands. But in her chest, something that had been cold for 3 years was beginning, slowly and painfully, to change. "You have proof," the Earl said. It was not quite a question. He would have made sure of it. She thought of the brooch locked upstairs. She thought of the inscription. E.H. from her mother. "I have something," she said carefully. "Whether it is proof enough, I don't know." "Show me." She went upstairs and unlocked the trunk and brought the brooch down. He had produced something of his own while she was gone. A small silver frame, worn at the corners from many years of handling, set with a painted miniature portrait. He held it toward her without speaking, and she saw it was a portrait of a woman she knew, younger, painted in the fashion of 20 years prior. But unmistakably, the woman whose face she had been told all her life was her own face grown older. The woman from the daguerreotype that had once hung in the upstairs hall, before Penn had it taken down in the first week. "That is my mother," she said. "It was among your father's effects," the Earl said. "He wrote in a letter that it was one of a pair, that the other was given to his daughter to keep." Esme opened her hand and showed him the brooch. He looked at it for a long time. He looked at the miniature. He looked at the brooch again. "The back," she said. He turned it over. He read the inscription. He set it very carefully on the table beside the miniature frame, and for a moment he only looked at the two of them side by side, the mother and the daughter. The pair her father had split between 2 hands, so that one piece alone could not be dismissed, and 2 pieces together could not be denied. "Penn knew," the Earl said. "He has known from the beginning," Esme said. "He placed me here himself. He told me I would be housed and fed, and that making noise about my name would lead to worse arrangements. He told the county there was no heir, and you believed he could do it." "He did do it," she said. "He has done it for 3 years." The Earl was quiet, and then he said something she had not anticipated. He said, "I am sorry. Your father trusted me and I came late, and that lateness cost you 3 years I cannot give back." He said it plainly, without gesture or performance, the way a man says something he has been sitting with and is finally ready to put down. "But I would like, with your permission, to make up the ground now." And she felt the warmth continuing its slow, painful return. It did not go smoothly after that. Nothing that involved Oswald Penn ever went smoothly. By that evening, the brooch was gone from the estate room table where she had left it, trusting for one reckless hour that the house was safe. Penn had been in the room. She knew it the moment she saw the empty space on the table, and she knew, with cold certainty, what it meant. Penn had understood what the brooch was the moment the Earl asked to see it. He had taken the only physical proof she had, and he had gone to prepare his counter. She found the Earl in the library and told him flatly that the brooch was gone, that they were without physical evidence, that Penn would now go to whatever men stood behind him and build his case, and his case was old and certified, and had the full weight of 3 years of official record behind it. The Earl closed his book. "Yes," he said, "he will." "Then we have nothing," she said. "He has the county record. He has whatever story he means to tell. He has my brooch." Her voice did not crack. She was proud of that. "And you have a miniature portrait of a woman, received from a dead man's effects, which Penn will say you produced after the fact to support an imposture." "Yes," he said again in exactly the same tone. She stared at him. "You don't seem alarmed." He looked up. "I'm not alarmed," he said. "Sit down. I want to tell you what I did yesterday morning before you arrived, before Penn had any idea the ground had shifted." She sat. He sat across from her, and he told her. On the morning of his arrival, before he had spoken to Penn or reviewed the inventory, in Penn's presence, he had gone through the document alone with his solicitor Weathers. When he reached the entry for the seamstress bonded to the household, he had picked up a pen and crossed it through, and written in the margin in his own hand. "The individual noted in this entry is removed from this inventory. No person may be catalogued as transferable property. She is to be considered a free subject under the protection of the Earl of Aldcroft pending legal determination of her standing. Signed, Dunhill. Witnessed this day by Weathers, solicitor of record." He had handed the document to Weathers and told him to file the notated copy with the county court that morning, before the transfer signing had occurred. "Weathers filed it at 9 o'clock, the Earl said. "Before Penn knew I had read to the end of the inventory. Before Penn knew there was anything to worry about. Before he had any possibility of preparing a counter." Esme looked at him. "They will build whatever case they build," the Earl said. "Penn will produce the forged indenture. He will produce his witnesses. He will argue that you are a bonded servant with no standing and no legitimate claim. Every document he has is older than anything we can produce today, except for one." He spread his hands on the table. "The notation in the county-filed inventory predates everything Penn will do from this moment forward. It predates his counterclaim. It predates any letter he writes tonight to the men who helped him 3 years ago. On the day he believed he was passing a seamstress along with the furniture, the court already had on record that the woman in question was a free subject under my protection, her status to be determined by law." He met her eyes. "Their entire structure requires you to be property. Property can be transferred. Property can be claimed. Property has no standing before a court in her own name." He paused. "I made you a person before Penn could build his case, and a person cannot be unmade by a forged indenture." For a long moment Esme said nothing. She thought of 3 years of gray dresses, 3 years of keeping her eyes at floor level and her tongue behind her teeth, 3 years of being worth less than a parlor clock in the reckoning of a man who had been afraid of her since before she understood why. "You didn't know who I was when you wrote that," she said. "No," he said. "I knew only what the inventory told me, that someone had written a person into a list of goods and furniture and intended to transfer her with the rest." He shook his head slightly. "I didn't need to know who you were. I needed to know that it was wrong." Penn did not go quietly. Penn had spent 3 years and considerable expense constructing the story of her non-existence, and he defended it with the vigor of a man who knew exactly what was at stake. He produced an indenture document, signed and witnessed, purporting to show that Esme had voluntarily bound herself into domestic service against her late father's debts. He produced the official who had registered Lord Aldcroft's death without issue. He produced 2 of his 3 original witnesses, the third having inconveniently moved to Nova Scotia. He also produced the brooch. which he described as a piece of domestic jewelry found among the household effects and removed for proper inventory. His solicitor was better paid than Weathers. His documentation was older and thicker, and carried more official seals. But the county-filed inventory, annotated in the Earl of Aldcroft's hand, and witnessed by Weathers at 9 o'clock on the morning of his arrival, was in the court record before any of Penn's responsive documents existed. And that was the thing Penn could not undo, because he had not known, on the morning the Earl arrived, that there was anything to prepare for. He had sent no letters. He had made no arrangements. He had stood at the front steps with his hand extended and his best warmth deployed, entirely certain that a careful reading of the inventory would never reach the last entry. He had been so confident in his own management of things that he had let a full hour pass before he thought to check what a meticulous man might have been reading alone in an estate room. The case came before the court in the spring. The Earl's lawyers asked, in open proceedings, how an indenture document dated 3 years prior had come to be found among Penn's papers only after an Earl had notated a county record, placing the same woman under his protection. They asked why the official who had recorded Lord Aldcroft's death as issueless had, on 3 separate prior occasions, provided similar records for other estates under Penn's administration. They asked how a shell cameo brooch described by Penn as a household effect came to bear on its reverse an inscription naming the late Lord Aldcroft's daughter by name. The miniature portrait the Earl produced in open court alongside letters from Lord Aldcroft clearly referencing his daughter. The brooch was subpoenaed from Penn's solicitor's office. When the 2 objects were set side by side, and the inscription on the back of the brooch was read aloud, and the painted faces were held next to the face of the woman sitting in the witness box, the courtroom went quiet in the particular way of people who have just understood something that was in front of them all along. Penn's witnesses discovered, under sustained examination, that their memories had been purchased rather than lived, and that purchased memories are fragile under pressure. The official who had filed the false county record chose, when given the choice between maintaining a lie and facing its consequences, to give honest evidence instead. The case took 4 months in total. Esme spent those months at Aldcroft Manor, not in the mending room, but in the rooms that had been her father's, the library and the east sitting room with the window that looked over the lawn she had watched from the servant's stair for 3 years. The Earl had taken rooms at the inn in the village, which was not necessary, and which he had arranged without being asked, because he seemed to understand without explanation what it would mean to her to be in that house as herself rather than as a fixture in its inventory. Dottie, the cook, who had been at Aldcroft Manor for 11 years and had known Lord Aldcroft when the house was full of warmth, took one look at Esme settled properly in the east sitting room and said, wiping her hands on her apron, "I knew it. Said it to myself the first week you were here. That is Lord Aldcroft's daughter, or I am a floor mop." She considered this for a moment. Your father held a teacup with 3 fingers, and the knuckle turned out just so. I used to watch him at breakfast. It's not a learned thing, that. It's bred into a person. I've watched you for 3 years doing the exact same thing and saying nothing, because what good would it have done? But there's getting it back now. She turned back to her stove. So, go ahead and know it. Esme laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in that house, and the sound of it surprised her. The title came back in the autumn. The estate, the name in the county record, all of it restored and entered in the public register by a court that had, once it was finally permitted to look, found the truth straightforwardly enough beneath the surface of Penn's arrangements. Penn was removed from the county. The official who had filed the false records was removed from his position. The 3-year story of a girl who did not exist was corrected by a single brief entry stating her name, her standing, and the date on which the court confirmed them both. The brooch she wore again. She put it on the morning the judgment came through, standing in her mother's dressing room before the mirror that had hung there since before she was born, and she looked at herself in it and thought that 3 years of gray dresses left marks you could not always see, and that getting them out took time, and that she had time now. The Earl came to the manor on a Saturday in October. She met him in the east sitting room because she had decided they had spent quite enough time in the estate room. They talked for an hour about her father, about the letters that had come too late, about the school in the north where he and Edwin Halwood had been boys together, and the debt he had felt he owed ever since. He spoke of it plainly, without embellishment, the way he seemed to do everything. She listened the way she had learned to listen in 3 years of careful necessity, and she heard under the plain words the grief of a man who had been given one chance to repay a kindness and had arrived late to it. She told him that late was not the same as never. She told him that what he had done on the morning of his arrival, before he had known any of it, before her name had meant anything to him beyond a wrong line in a wrong document, had already mattered more than he seemed to understand. He asked what she meant. She said, "You read to the end of the inventory. Most men would have stopped at the silver." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I noticed the entry because it was wrong, a line out of place. I didn't know what it meant yet. I only knew it didn't belong where they had written it." "And so you took out a pen," she said. "And so I took out a pen," he agreed. The east window was full of the particular autumn light that she had always associated with this house, at its best, the low amber kind that made even the worn furniture look like it had stories worth telling. Outside, the lawn she had watched from the servant's stare for 3 years was going bronze at the edges, the way it went every October, the way it had gone each year she had been in this house without quite being in it. The miniature portrait sat on the writing desk where she had placed it the day she moved back into her own rooms. Her mother's profile, worn smooth from years of her father's hands, and then from the hands of a man who had carried it north, not knowing where it truly belonged, keeping it until he could bring it home. Esme looked at it and thought that her father had known what he was doing when he split the pair. He had understood that 2 pieces together could not be denied. He had only not lived to see them put back where they belonged. She looked at the Earl. He was watching her with the patient attention she had come to know as simply how he was. A man who paid attention, who read to the end of lists, who noticed the line that did not belong and stopped rather than signed his name beneath it. "Thank you," she said, "for not signing." "Thank you," he said, "for not looking at the floor." They were married the following spring, in the small church at Aldcroft village, a quiet wedding, because neither of them had much use for grand affairs, having each spent sufficient years being assessed and catalogued by people who confused ceremony with worth. The inventory hung framed in the estate room. Esme had wanted to burn it. The Earl had asked her to keep it instead. She had looked at the terrible line, "Seamstress bonded," to transfer with the property, and then she had read the line crossed firmly through it in his hand, and the notation in the margin below, and she had understood that the same page held both the harm and its undoing, and that there was something in that worth remembering. She kept it. She kept the pen as well, the one Weathers had handed him on the morning of his arrival. It sat on her writing desk beside her mother's portrait. And sometimes in the early mornings, before the house came fully awake, she picked it up and turned it in her hands and thought of a man arriving at an estate he did not yet own, reading a document he had not yet signed, going all the way to the bottom of a list where the unimportant things were filed, the drapes and the dairy press, and the woman written between them, and stopping, not out of prior knowledge, not because he had been looking for her, simply because something was wrong, and he was the kind of man who noticed when something was wrong, and who did not sign his name beneath it regardless. Outside, the grounds were coming green again in the spring light. Her grounds, her name on the deed, her father's house returned to his daughter at last, not because the world had suddenly decided to be fair, but because one man had read an inventory all the way to the bottom and asked, quietly, for a pen. She set the pen down, and below in the kitchen she could hear Dottie singing, the same song she had always sung, now sung in a house with its right occupants finally in it. Esme went down to join her, not a line in anyone's ledger, not a fixture to be passed from hand to hand, but herself, wholly and legally and simply herself.